The topic tonight is the third revolution in industry and human consciousness. The underlying premise is that if you look at human history, there have been three major shifts in economic history or industrial production. And if you look at those shifts, they correlate very closely. They're very intertwined with shifts in human consciousness, and we're undergoing that right now. The people and businesses and organizations and institutions that are able to understand and leverage the evolutionary pattern that I'm talking about will recognize barriers and opportunities that few others are able to see. It doesn't really matter if you're in a tech industry, if you are a content marketer, if you are a realtor, if you sell shoes for a living. It doesn't matter what industry you're in. It has to do with how you see the world and human action around you. So let's step back for a second. Let's take a step back. And so the title tonight, of course, is the third revolution in industry and human consciousness. What I'm talking about are the three major shifts in our economic structure as a planet that we've seen in modern history. So we are entering now, we are on the cusp of the third, but let's take a step back a second and look at the first two. The first shift in human consciousness is the shift from agriculture to steam-powered industry, the Industrial Revolution. But where that started, even though we think of the Industrial Revolution happening in the 17 and 1800s, where the Industrial Revolution really started was back in the 1400s. The Gutenberg and the invention of the printing press. When the printing press was introduced, two major things happened, and this is where the human consciousness part comes in. First of all, society in general became radically more literate. People could read because now they had more access to books. There were books prior to that, and this is where the shift in human consciousness comes. But the books were a very rarefied thing. They were copied by hand, almost entirely by scribes who were monks, so that most of the printed books were religious church doctrine, things like that. When the printing press came into existence, what it did was it created this revolution in human thinking so that the average person now had access to printed material, could learn to read, and not only that, the average person now understood that they too could become an author. They too could write a book. Prior to that, only those at the absolute upper echelons of society could write anything and have it disseminated. So there was this really heavy-duty elitism. So what happened was it created a revolution in human thinking. Suddenly what it meant to be human was redrafted from the ground up. Prior to that, everything was by right of birth, divine right. So there was tremendous injustice, there was tremendous suffering, there was tremendous violence in society. And a lot of that had to do with society wasn't grounded in rights or privileges. It was grounded in this sort of notion that there was this mystical order to things. That when the human mind got opened in this way, it eventually led to what was called rationalism, which then led to the Industrial Revolution. Industrial Revolution then was, it was steam-powered, which eventually in the 1800s led to railroad. So over time, the Industrial Revolution, you know, it gathered momentum. The communication technology shifted. For a while there, it was printed books, printed material. All of a sudden, we started to have the telegraph and then the telephone, and what we had is this sort of centralized network of communication technology, and what that led to was 20th century industry, factories, manufacturing and distribution by truck, automobile. And for a lot of us, like myself and a few others, we remember we kind of were born in the waning days of the cosmopolitan industry. So now we're entering this third phase of industrial, I guess you could say, revolution. The third industrial revolution, a guy named Jeremy Rifkin talks a lot about this. And the third industrial revolution is really about decentralized communication, mobile communication, low cost, no cost communication, information processing, and almost zero cost transportation, because as energy becomes more efficient and it becomes cheaper, and as transportation becomes more automated, we are going to become more connected than ever. And of course, the key thing with the third industrial revolution here is mobile technology. Basically, this little device here, I can literally reach out right now in this little thing that I can fit in my pocket and talk to almost anyone in the world who has exactly the same thing, even if we don't speak the same language. Isn't that cool? I could use Google Translate and communicate with them. So those are the three revolutions. We've got the printing press, and we go from agriculture to industrial revolution, then we go to cosmopolitan industry, the big factories that we had throughout the 20th century. And the third revolution now is basically the digital or internet age. In the first two industrial revolutions, what we were looking at was that value was produced, money was made through the exchange, transfer, refinement of material goods. We would turn ore in the ground into steel, and we would build skyscrapers and cars. However, in this third industrial revolution, what's happening is something very different, because in the first two, the barriers and limitations were physical barriers, physical substances, and the whole kind of economic system was framed around physical human limitations. However, when we shift to the digital age, there's still manufacturing, but the key barriers, the key limits are not material limitations, but human limitations. Because what we do is we shift from an industrial era to a relational era, where what we're really moving around now is knowledge, it's ideas, it's concepts. And what we find most frequently is that the barriers there, they are not material, they are relational. They have to do with the ability of people, the barriers that keep people from communicating openly. So in the third industrial revolution, the key is relationality. And here's what I mean by that. My own research, what I found when I did my PhD research, was that the key determinant in team effectiveness working in high disruptive environments, it wasn't training, it wasn't expertise, it wasn't resources, it was the level of psychological safety amongst the teams. How safe those people felt in being vulnerable, expressing mistakes, things like that. As we see now in this new industrial revolution, the shift in consciousness has to do with starting to become hyper aware of the barriers that separate us from other people and in feeling safe around other people. And what we're talking about here is that success in industry, in business, in organizations, it's no longer about material strategies. It's about relational strategies. And once we get that, once we see that, once we get that mindset, everything starts to change. It doesn't matter what type of business that you are in. Success or failure in any industry is going to have to do with relational ecology. How comfortable people feel with each other, sharing information and strategizing collaboratively. Once you grasp the underlying principles of that and understand that we've gone from material limitations to relational limitations, once you see that, you're at an incredible advantage. You're grasping an underlying evolutionary pattern, not just in how money is made, but how people relate. And underneath all this is this ongoing growth process. We have these three industrial revolutions, and what we see there is a linear trajectory, an ongoing, you can draw a straight line from where people were at from the printing press days to where they are at now in the industrial era and in the digital era, and what I would call the hyper digital era, where even the technology itself starts to disappear. We see that those who can see that life is continuing to push us into an era where we are being challenged to look at our own limitations and defensive,ness and our own ability to connect with others. Once we see that, and we can see that this is a pattern that's been going on for years, for centuries, for millennia, we're at a distinct advantage that others in our industries, our competitors, would not have. I'm just going to give you one little example. Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs was revolutionary. He was a genius because he understood this process. Now I understand that he was a tyrant to work for at times, but what he understood was that human beings were moving towards greater and greater connectivity. And because you look at the products that he developed, the iPhone, the iPad, they only make sense in light of the recognition that human beings are growing more and more connected and are yearning. There's this the internal yearning to be more connected. And again, as I said, it doesn't matter what industry you're in, doesn't matter what your background. Once you get that, you will start to recognize in your environment around you the little blips, the little indicators, the weak signals that show those patterns emerging. And when you can grasp onto those patterns and leverage those patterns, you're going to have an advantage that other people don't.